This is Ken Elchert, and he is giving a presentation on the Bethlehem, the Star of Bethlehem. And he gave this once a few years ago. He's published a book on it, and by popular request, he has returned. So, Ken?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Gary.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, let's see if I can get this going.
There you go.
Okay, so a lot of you probably are wondering why in the world I'm giving a presentation on the Star of Bethlehem a month after Christmas. But believe it or not, the Star of Bethlehem is not a story of Christmas, it's a story of Epiphany. Christmas is the celebration of Jesus's birth. Epiphany is the celebration of Jesus actually meeting the Gentiles, which are represented by the Magi in the story. There's 12 days of Christmas, and after the 12 days of Christmas, we have Epiphany, which is in the month of January. Okay, what I want to point out here is that I'm not a biblical scholar by no means of the expression. I'm an engineer, and I don't know anything other than engineering on how to give a presentation. So, and it's also the way I do things when I do my research. So when I go through this presentation, you'll see a lot of systems engineering in here. I use systems engineering tools to do the job, and what you'll find out is that I think it works pretty good. See what happened there. What happened there?
Here, get off that square. There's a square there that's being displayed.
Don't know.
Here.
I just, that's the thing.
Yeah, we got rid of the square.
What I want to make clear to you is that I have no idea whether this Matthew story about the Magi and the Star of Bethlehem is true or not. My primary purpose in doing the research was to figure out if it could possibly have happened, and if so, what the star was. And so that's the approach I've taken. I have no bias whatsoever, one way or the other, and I leave it upon all of you to make your own judgment as to whether the story might be true. Oh man, I don't know what I'm doing wrong here. I'm sorry. I'm just clicking.
How to get the cursor off to a different side.
What side do I need to get the cursor on?
Okay. Or you can hit the N for next, either way. Good.
But anyway, just to let you know, I do have a plan. This is the roadmap that we'll be following. This is an engineering tool I use all the time to lay out the process that needs to be done to get to the final answer. All the squares that you see there in blue are things that need to be done to determine, get answers to questions that need to be answered. And one of the key things that I have in here is what's shown in yellow. It's identified as stellarium. That is a astronomy application which makes this all possible. Without stellarium, I would not have been able to pull this off at all.
Let's see if we can.
Okay. So let's start at the beginning. We're going to start at the 2nd century BC. What happened at that time was there was a new development in Jewish religion. It's called Messianism. What that was that it was a belief amongst the Jews that there would be a Messiah or a Savior who would come to rescue the Jews from their captors and to make the Jewish state basically an idyllic place to live. But Christians believe that the messianic prophets were fulfilled in Jesus of Nazareth. He lived 2,000 years ago in a region that is now Israel. Events in his life are recorded in the Gospels, and according to the Gospel of Matthew, a star was seen by the Magi, which signaled his birth. Today, it's called the Star of Bethlehem. And according to my theory, that star appeared 2,025 years ago this year. So this is a summary of the prophecies that were fulfilled in Matthew's Gospel. Goes from Matthew 1:1 to Matthew 2:19. And as you can see, the first column basically is the verse and chapter that appears in Matthew's Gospel where the prophecy was fulfilled. The next column is the prophecy itself that was fulfilled. The next column is the prophecy that was recorded, where it was recorded in the Bible. And then when that particular prophecy was actually written. As you can see in the last column, a lot of these prophecies occurred many centuries before the 2nd century when Messianism appeared, with one exception. That is Daniel 9:25. And that's going to be an important thing in our investigation as we proceed here. Yes, so.
Got it.
Okay. Now, it turns out that we only have one account of the Star of Bethlehem, and that is Matthew's Gospel. There is no other account that is independent of Matthew's Gospel. As far as we can tell right now is that all the other versions of the story go back to Matthew's Gospel. So we have to rely on Matthew's Gospel for trying to get an answer to all of our questions. Now, it turns out, and a lot of people don't realize this, I think, is that Matthew's source for the gospel, or for his recording of the Star of Bethlehem and the Magi, must have been Mary, the mother of Jesus. And I'll show you why I say that in just a second. The next one. So these are the 11 verses where the Star of Bethlehem appears in Matthew's Gospel. I won't read all verses. I'll read the first two to give you a flavor of what Matthew's Gospel is all about as far as the nativity is concerned. One thing that you'll notice when I read this is that his account of that time is very concise. There's a lot of information in a very few words. He says, after Jesus' birth in Bethlehem of Judea, during the reign of King Herod, Magi from the east arrived one day in Jerusalem, inquiring, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage. There's a lot of information here. You got King Herod, you got the star, where they're from, who they are, just in the first two verses there. So this is where I say that Mary must have been the source. This is another engineering tool. I did this many times on the space shuttle program, getting documents where I would have to determine who does what. But what I did for each verse in his nativity part of the gospel, I have identified who the witnesses were. It's very apparent when you read his gospel who he is talking to, or who was involved in the conversation. So we have Mary, the mother of Jesus. We have Joseph, the father. We have Jesus himself, the Magi, King Herod, the people of Jerusalem, the chief priests and scribes of Jerusalem. We have Herod's soldiers, Bethlehem people, and then we have Matthew in the scripture quotes over here at the end. You notice under Mary, we have a lot of X's indicating that she was privy to that information. There's some blanks here. Those blanks that are appearing there probably became oral tradition. What that means is that the people around Bethlehem and Jerusalem may have started that as a traditional thing that happened back, at the time of the nativity. Over here also, it turns out that the Magi are mentioned without anybody else around. And it's very apparent that if the story is true, and Mary indeed was the source, you can reconstruct the conversation that the Magi had with Mary by those verses that are shown there as lines on the left. Okay, now I have something very interesting. Let me get this real quick from you, Gary. If you go to a bookstore like Barnes and Noble today, you'll find a magazine called the Biblical Archaeology Review. I got this issue just about a month ago. And in that issue is a story that's called What is the Star of Bethlehem? And according to the author, Nathan Steinmeier, he says that unfortunately the Gospel of Matthew is of little help in pinning down what the Star of Bethlehem did. I take that as a direct challenge. We got something that Steinmeier never heard of. It's called systems engineering. So let's go on and see what happens here. First thing I did was I listed all the different facts and inferences that you can gather from Matthew's gospel. And I came up with a total of 15 numbers on here. Out of those 15, 9 of those facts were usable as criteria against which you could judge different candidates for the Star of Bethlehem. The next one, Gary. The next thing I did was I listed the candidates. And my going in assumption was that the Star of Bethlehem was not a miracle, but it was natural. It's not a natural object that you can see at night in the sky. So I listed all those that appear in the night sky on the top here. And you'll notice that I have the planets listed along with the other objects: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus. I have one object that probably should not be on this list, which is the moon, but I added that for completeness. The phenomena that I did not include are listed on the bottom, but I won't go into those. So what I did was I came up with the assessment matrix. This is another systems engineering tool. On the left are the candidates listed from meteor all the way down to nova and supernova. On the top, across the top, I have the criteria that I drew from Matthew's gospel. And for every intersection of those, the column and row, I put it, I answered the question: is it a single object? Is it visible for months? On and on. After I did this, I was astounded. Usually when you do an assessment matrix like this, you can narrow down the candidates to maybe 2 or 3. This one narrows it down to one object: Jupiter. What Steinmeier said was impossible, we made look easy with systems engineering. Okay, Gary. Okay, what's interesting about Jupiter is it falls in very well with various things. For example, Jupiter as the star of Bethlehem fits, hang on. To the Babylonians, Jupiter represented Marduk. Marduk was the top god of the Babylonians. Babylonian was the highest god. He is the patron deity of the city of Babylon. He was the god of the rising sun. In Bethlehem mythology, Marduk was the savior of the world. And Babylonia was located due east of Jerusalem, just as in Matthew's gospel, he said that the Magi came from the east. The chief temples of Marduk were the Esagila and the Menaki, which are the two biggest temples in ziggurats in Babylonia. Now, who were the Magi? Classical authors unanimously regarded them as Zoroastrian priests. They were religious people, a priestly caste. References to the Magi during the Nativity include Strabo, Philo, Pliny the Elder, Acts of the Apostles, and they all takes on the Magi. But by the 1st century AD, the term was used for wise men in the Parthian and Roman empires. So Rome was to the west, the Parthian Empire was to the east. So guess what? At the time of the Nativity, the Magi inhabited Media, Persia, Assyria, Babylonia, and the Parthian Empire. And many today believe that the Magi were important individuals who may have served as court advisors and probably traveled with a large entourage when they visited foreign locations. Okay, you're right. Now I got a problem. The Magi obviously would not have been interested in astronomy or astrology, which is key to the story. So what's the story? Well, it turns out that Matthew's Magi probably were from Babylonia. That's a region of the Parthian Empire. That's due east of Jerusalem. And that area is noted for its astronomers and astrologers. As court advisors, the Magi probably made forecasts and predictions for their royal partners. So I think we're on the right path. Now, a little bit on Babylonian astronomy. According to Strabo, the astronomers in Babylonia were divided into different groups that held different dogmas. And it turns out that in the Babylonian region, archaeologists have found a lot of astronomical clay tablets that were produced by the Babylonians. Most of those were found in Babylon and Uruk. A few have also been found in Nippur, Sippar, and Ur. All are in the same area where the Jews had been resettled during the exile. The Babylonian names for Jupiter and Regulus were very pertinent to the story. Turns out that the Babylonian name for Jupiter was Mol Babar, meaning white star. They didn't call it a planet, they didn't call it a nebula, they didn't call it anything other than a star. And in the story of the Star of Bethlehem by Matthew, the object that the Magi saw is always referred to as a star. The Babylonian name for Regulus, which is the brightest star in Leo, which is going to be an important thing when we come and do more investigation, was called Lugal, and that means king. So keep that in mind also. Okay, just to show you where everything is, Jerusalem is over here as indicated on the left. And on the right, we have, guess what? Sippar, Babylon, Nippur, Uruk, and Ur, where all the astronomical clay tablets were found that were produced by the Babylonians. And note that that region is due east of Jerusalem. Okay, you got another problem. Babylonians would not have cared about a Jewish Messiah. Well, let's see what we can do to find out if that's true or not. Turns out that right around 600 BC, the Babylonians invaded the Judea area where the Jews lived. And what happened in 597 BC is that Nebuchadnezzar II, the king of Babylonia, deported 10,000 Judeans to Babylon. And guess where they were deported to? That same area that I showed you where the clay tablets were found. The Jews were influenced by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians were influenced by the Jews. I have a few examples shown right there. Turns out that in 40 BC, in Jerusalem, the Jewish people actually had a high priest who was from Babylon, or Babylonian. Okay, so it looks like we're pretty much on the right task, or right path, right track. And so what I'm going to do now is we're going to take a little bit of a turn here, and we're going to try to determine when Jesus was born. Of course, that is self-evident. Everybody knows that Jesus was born on December the 25th in the year 0, right? Well, let's look into that and see if that's true or not. Now, it turns out that's not right. December the 25th was probably picked for being 9 months after the vernal equinox, when the incarnation of Jesus was assumed to have taken place. So December 25th was not taken to be his birthday, but the day of his incarnation, which is when he became, human being, basically. Okay, so in fact, December the 25th was not picked to be a Christmas day until right around about, I think it was Pope Liberius, back in December the 25th, AD 354, 354 years later. And as far as year 0, there was no such thing as a year 0 in the AD BC calendar system. In fact, the AD part didn't take place until AD 525, and BC didn't happen until 200 years later in 731 AD. What it turns out to be is that nobody knows for sure what day Jesus was born on, and they don't really know what year, believe it or not. However, the best information we have places his birth in 3 BC or 2 BC. There were 13 different Christian authorities at that time who recorded that they thought that he had been born, when they thought he was born. And of those 13, I'm sorry, I think of the, I have it here. Oh yeah, of those, 11 of them placed the nativity around 3 BC and 2 BC. So guess what? I picked 3 BC and 2 BC to home in on to get an idea of how Magi might have pulled this off. Hey, Gary. Now I've got another problem. Most references state that Herod the Great died in 4 BC. That's before 3 BC and 2 BC. So how could Jesus have been born after Herod the Great died, when Matthew says that the Magi had come to see had come to see King Herod about the birth, and sometime before 4 BC apparently. Well, it seems like it's a tough problem, but let's see what we can come up with. It turns out that the Jews at that time really didn't know the dates, the real dates of their key events in history. Flavius Josephus, he's our best source of information on Herod the Great. And according to all his information that you can use to determine when he died, it all indicates that he died in 2 BC. It's contrary to most of the authors that you read, stories about the Star of Bethlehem and things of that type, about the nativity. But it's true, I have some key experts who claim the same thing. They all say he must have died in 2 BC. The thing of it is what's important here is that Flavius Josephus gives us another clue as to when he died. He says very clearly that there was an eclipse of the moon right before he died. If you look at the record, there are four dates around that time that could be candidates. Most people will say, hey, it's a no-brainer. He died in 4 BC. Must have been a total eclipse of the moon in 4 BC. Let's get that one. Not the case, and I'll show you why in a little bit. What I believe is that it was the 4th octave, January the 9th. It happened actually on 2 days. It started on the evening of the 9th, ended on the morning of the 10th in 1 BC. Herod the Great, oh yeah, that's okay. So this is my reason. This is a depiction of the eclipse in March of 4 BC on the left. This is the depiction of the eclipse in January of 1 BC. You'll notice that the one that happened in 4 BC was a partial eclipse, and it wasn't much of a partial eclipse at all. Anybody who had been out looking at the moon and looking at that eclipse would not have noticed much of any difference in the moon because it was a partial eclipse. If you look at the one over here on the right for 1 BC, that was a beautiful total eclipse. Not only that, the eclipse over here in 4 BC started a little bit after midnight. This one over here in 1 BC started before midnight, when people would have been noticing what was happening in the sky. That's why I think that it was really 1 BC. This eclipse here that happened right before King Herod died. Okay, so what we need to do now is try to determine how the Babylonians viewed the sky. We need to find out how they divided the sky up along the zodiac. We also need to know how they were able to determine events in Jupiter's yearly cycle. So let's go on. This is a listing of the signs in the zodiac from Leo to Cancer. This is not in the order that you normally find the signs listed. It turns out that the Babylonians, for them, the key sign was Leo, Leo the lion. So I start off my list with Leo, go all the way down to Cancer. The next column here is the name of the sign. So for example, Leo was Gu La. And the mole at the beginning indicates that it's a star. The mole in Babylonian was star. You look over here on the next column, I have what I call the Babylonian longitude. I was able to get that by examining the clay tablets that the Babylonians produced. I didn't have them physically with me, but on the internet, you can find out how, how those Babylonian tablets were translated, and you can go through and you can determine. One thing that is nice about those clay tablets is that the Babylonians recorded when Jupiter went into each different sign. And by knowing that, you can, knowing, and they also give you the date. So knowing the date and when Jupiter went into the sign, you can go to your stellarium or, other astronomy application and find out what the ecliptic longitude was for that location in the sky. And I came out with a relationship that shows that all you have to do is add 117 degrees to the Babylonian longitude to come up with the ecliptic longitude. What amazes me is that when you read all these different stories, theories about Star of Bethlehem, I have never seen this equation. I have no idea how people can determine what sign Jupiter was in at any given time without a relationship like this. It's just beyond me. But anyway, that's my contribution. Okay, so one thing neat about Jupiter is that it goes through an annual cycle, and there's certain key events that you would expect to keep, try to keep track of. Let's see. Well, one thing I guess I ought to mention is that, when you read Matthew's gospel, he says that the Magi had seen the star at its rising in the east. And when you look at the Babylonian clay tablets, they always note the heliacal rising of the planets, Jupiter being one of them. The heliacal rising is the first appearance of the object ever after its conjunction with the sun. So it's the first time that you get to see Jupiter, for example, after it's been missing from the sky all this, for the last 30 days or so. That was a key thing for the Babylonians. And I think that when you read Matthew's gospel, the Magi are actually referring to the heliacal rising of Jupiter. So, Jupiter's orbital period is about 12 years long. That means that it starts its cycle about every 12, let's put it this way. In a 1 year period, what you do is you have Jupiter making 1/12 of its rotation or orbit around the sun. Well, what the Earth has to do to catch up, it has to make one revolution and then have to make a little bit more to make up for that 1/12 of the orbit. So what it turns out is that Jupiter's average synodic period is not 365 days, it's 399 days. So the time between successive heliacal risings of Jupiter is about a year and a month. And that is a rule of thumb that the Babylonians probably used to determine about what time Jupiter would be expected to be seen as heliacal rising. As far as the location, it turns out that in a year's time, the sun goes from it goes through all the signs of the zodiac in 1 year, but Jupiter, making only 1/12 of that distance, goes through, it hops from one zodiac sign to the next one. in general. So that's another way that you can predict not only when you see the helical rising, but also when. I'm sorry, where. So if it appeared, for example, in Leo 1 year, you would expect to see it in Virgo the next year. So in 32 BC, the helical risings of Jupiter would have been on July the 29th of 3 BC and August the 29th of 2 BC. The important one being the last one, that one occurred in Leo, and you'll see why in a little bit. This is a depiction of the zodiac, basically around the rim of this circular diagram. You'll notice the names of each of the signs of the zodiac. So to show you what I mean by being able to predict where and when the next helical rising might be for Jupiter, I listed them on here. So, for example, in 13 BC was in Virgo, 12 BC, about 30 degrees away, was in Libra, and then the Scorpius, and then Sagittarius, skipped Capricorn, went to Aquarius, Pisces, Aries, and finally, in 3 BC, it rose in Cancer, and like I said, in 2 BC, it rose in Leo. So this would be a nice way to try to estimate when to look and where to look for the helical rising of Jupiter. Okay, Gary. So this is a linear spread out of the events of the Jupiter's annual cycle. This is for 3 BC and 2 BC. The cycle starts at the helical rising, which, as I said, was over there in July, I think it's July the 29th of 3 BC. And then it ends at the helical rising for the next cycle, which is right around August the 29th of 2 BC. But in between, we have all these different events. There's what I call the stations, which is the place in Jupiter's location where, as observed from the Earth, Jupiter comes to a standstill, and instead of then going prograde, it goes retrograde. So instead of going eastward, it goes westward. But it doesn't do that forever. Then it has to make another turn. So as viewed from the Earth, it makes a second stationary point, which I call the second station, which is where it goes from retrograde to prograde again. And all these times that I have listed here are different for each cycle. Not by much, but because the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit and Jupiter's orbit, these change all the time. And it's an interesting thing. One of the clay tablets that was found not too long ago from Babylon was interpreted by one of the archaeologists, and he found out that the Babylonians actually used calculus. They developed calculus to make an estimate for Jupiter's next appearance. I think that's significant. It tells me that they regarded Jupiter as very important. And as you can see, being a representing basically Marduk, why they would do that. They regarded it very highly. Okay, next. Now, one of the things that is really neat about that particular set of years, 3 BC and 2 BC, is this right here. It turns out that there are a lot of different, well, I guess you would call them, I call them near misses, but they're basically conjunctions and let's see, here they are, apples. one of the things that, well, I'll tell you, Apples is a very similarly named term for a conjunction. It's a special one though. Conjunctions are basically when you have two objects at the same line ascension. An appulse is the very closest approach between two objects, whether they're at the same conjunction or not. And all the ones that I have circled were all visible from Babylon. So what is neat about this is that if the Babylonians attach significance to these conjunctions, they had a whole series of them to view at this particular time. And this one in particular, the one between the moon and Venus, happens only so often. You have to have the moon tilted to a high inclination. Well, it's going to be at a high inclination. Yeah, it would be high inclination, and it has to be aligned with the zodiac in such a way that it will actually do, make some close encounters with Regulus. So that I think is significant. Okay, next one. Okay, this one just shows that there was a triple conjunction between Regulus and the moon. And this just shows that prograde versus retrograde loop that Jupiter made at that time. And you can see with Regulus over here, near the center bottom, you can see that on each one of those passes, it made a close encounter with Regulus. I think that the Babylonians may have looked upon that as a pretty significant event, only because of the fact that this does not occur all the time. This is something that I think that they would have found very interesting. Okay, next. Okay, so there's another thing that was very interesting too. Besides the triple conjunction between the moon and Jupiter, I guess it was Jupiter and Regulus, there was also what I call a merger of two planets. It was Jupiter and Venus. And this is very rare. This happened, it had happened only 3 times since 1 BC. When you look at the bright planets or bright stars that you can see at night, Venus and Jupiter are amongst the very brightest. Venus is very bright. I'm not too sure if it outshines Sirius or not, but it's extremely bright. So when you have two bright planets like that coming together, it's a very neat sight to see. And this was all very clearly seen, or could be seen from Babylon. And in fact, what's nice about this too, which I think is significant, is that this merger actually occurred right near Regulus, the king star. I think that is very significant. So what you have is that you have circumstances of this event containing all the key attributes mentioned by the Magi. You have the Messiah, denoted by Jupiter. You have kingship, denoted by Regulus. You have the birth, denoted by the moon. And you have Judea, denoted by Leo the lion. So this must be the event that the Magi mentioned when they saw King Herod. So let's go to the next one. Okay, so this is the depiction I came up with. You can see that Venus is the occultating body here. It's overlapping a little bit of Jupiter. That overlap amounted to 2.75 arcseconds. So, the human eye is about 3 arc minutes in resolving power. So this clearly would have been seen as 2 stars coming together and merging together. Well, that's, in fact, what's interesting about this, I ran across one website that talked about this, And they said, well, Jupiter's magnitude was a negative 1.34, and Venus's magnitude was a negative 4. Therefore, the total magnitude must be 5.34. That's not the way it works. Turns out that the combined magnitude was 4.0 or negative 4.11. Venus by itself actually gets more bright than this. What's important about this merger is just the fact that they merged. And that's a very rare thing. Okay, Gary. Okay, so we got another problem though. Matthew quotes Magi saying they saw the star that's rising in the east. The Jupiter-Venus merger on June the 17th, 2 BC occurred as a set in the west. That could not have been it. You got to do some more research. Okay, so I'm going to get a little bit of background real quick. The Jews had special years that they had set aside as very special, very holy years. One was called the sabbatical year that occurred every 7 years. What happened on that in that year was that it was intended to be a year where you could pay back your debts, I think, to people that you owe money to. And it turns out that we don't know exactly which years were sabbatical. There are 2 different standards that have been developed over the years. One was back in the 19th century by Benedict Zuckerman. And the second one was done right around, I think, about 1940s, I think, by Wackerle. It turns out that the one that fits best for me is Zuckerman, and you'll find out a little bit why. There were also Jubilee years, and these Jubilee years were spread far apart. They occurred every 7th sabbatical year. So since a sabbatical year was every 7 years, a Jubilee year occurred every 49 years. And then they talk about, when you look at the documents that we have that were written about the Jubilee years, they talk about the decades of Jubilees, and that consisted of 10 sets of Jubilee years, and that constituted 490 years. That's a long time span. Let's see. Now, the thing of it is, like I say, there's no existing record of a Jubilee year actually having been observed, but the Dead Sea Scrolls that we have do indicate that the Essenes who lived at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, actually did observe them, but we don't know exactly when. Okay. Now there's some other key documents too. There's the Book of Jubilees, and as you would expect, it contains Jewish history over spans of Jubilees. And I think that covers a total of 2,450 years. It's a very long span of years that it covers. There's also the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel. I mentioned before that Daniel was going to be an important one. That is the only book in the Bible that you can use to make an estimate of when the Messiah might be expected. And turns out that the only that's what I just said. But the story ends with the appearance of the Messiah, the Prince, at the end of that decade. It turns out the 8th decade from the beginning, from the creation. Okay, so let's see. It turns out that when you look at all the different scrolls that were found at Qumran, that are called the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are 15 copies of the Book of Jubilees that are found. In addition, there are 8 copies of the Book of Daniel. It's very apparent to me, based on that they were very, very much interested in, the Jewish history, along with maybe trying to figure out when the Messiah was going to happen, was going to come. So let's go on to the next one here. Okay, so you got some more documents here. We got something that's called the pseudo Moses documents, which are Dead Sea Scrolls. We got the Damascus document, Dead Sea Scroll. And it turns out that these scrolls give important clues as to when the Messiah might come. And one of them, which is very key, is that the Melchizedek document indicates that he was expected after the 7 plus 62 weeks of years in the 70 weeks prophecy that he had, which filled up 1 decade of sabbatical or jubilee years. And that's very key. This would have been something that the Magi, if they had, could have used to make an estimate as to when they would expect to see a sign that the Messiah had arrived. Next one. Okay, now, this is an important one. There's a guy by the name of Roger Beckwith. He unfortunately died just a few months ago. He was in his 90s. And he wrote a book. And in the book, he mentions that, that he was able to determine approximate dates for the beginnings and endings of these jubilee years. And that was key to me. So he said, for example, that the 7th year week in Daniel's prophecy ended with the 70th sabbatical year between 3 BC and AD 2. It turns out that when you go back to the sabbatical years that were determined by Zuckerman and Wackelholder, Zuckerman says that within that time span, there is only 1 sabbatical year, that's 3-2 BC. So that, I think, is very important. And what it does is it places the assigned dating of the return from the exile in 493, 492 BC. And that's a little bit important too. Let's go to the next one here. This is the Jubilees all laid out from beginning to end. It starts over here with the creation, 3923 BC, and it ends in 3-2 BC. The important decade, there's 8 decades here laid out. The important one is the 8th one. And this is the one where the Messiah was expected to arrive. Okay, Barry? Now what I've done is I've taken that 8th decade and I've laid it out here. So I have all 10 jubilees within that decade being 10, I have 10 jubilees starting in 492 BC, with the return of the Jews from the Babylonian captivity, all the way to this key 10th jubilee year and 70th sabbatical year over here being 3 and 2 BC. Okay. Well, we got another problem though. I said that the Jews returned from exile in 493, 492 BC, but according to my calculations, it was in 538. I'm sorry. My calculations show 493, 492 BC, but in reality, when you look at the historical data, the Jewish exile ended in 538 BC. So there's a problem. So let's go over here and find out what we can do. Like I said before, the Jews, for some reason or other, are not reliable when it comes to dating key events in their own history at this time. For example, Josephus, so Josephus was way off in some of his dates, and same thing with the rabbis there and stuff, and you just can't rely on them. It turns out that when you get an indication of a key date from that time period, you can't rely on the veracity of it. Josephus, for example, he said that there were 481 or 471 years, depending on which book you're reading, between the return from the exile and the death of Aristobulus. And that is an error. Instead of either 481 or 471 years, that's an error of 46 to 36 years. Same thing with the rabbi over here, having an error of 165 years. So when I say that, that particular decade started at 493, 492 BC, that doesn't bother me because of the fact that the dating that the Jews had at this time was way, just way on. Okay, Jeremy. Okay, there's another problem though. The Essenes at Qumran were located hundreds of miles from the Magi. Magi therefore must not have had any knowledge of the Essene scrolls near the Dead Sea. And that might seem to be a problem. So let's see what we might be able to do about that. Okay, the Jews had 3 feasts at Jerusalem during the year where the males had to attend. Either even if you were not living in Israel at that time, what they would do is they would have pilgrimages to Jerusalem to make it to those festivals. Well, Babylonia is a pretty far distance away, and I think that if the Babylonians made their pilgrimages to Jerusalem, the rich ones would have been able to do that maybe once a year. But anyway, there was an opportunity for the Babylonians to make contact with Jews in Jerusalem because of that particular thing. When you read Josephus, he says that there were about 4,000 Essenes who lived in Judea about that time. The problem with that, though, is that even though they may have had an opportunity to intermingle, talk to each other, he says that the Essenes studiously avoided contact with outsiders. So the likelihood of any information being exchanged between the Essenes and Babylonians was probably pretty low. However, it's not so much getting information directly from the Essenes as just getting the information, which, as I had shown, is actually recorded in other documents. So instead of making contact with the Essenes, they could have just received some of the documents and have the information upon which you could make an estimate as to when to expect the Messiah to come. So let's go over here. The key documents over here on the left are listed. I have the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Daniel, the Testament of Levi, 1 Enoch, Damascus document, Moses document, and Melchizedek document. And over here on the right-hand column, I show whether or not any of those documents or books have been found by archaeologists outside of Jerusalem. And as you can see, they've, the first 5 here have actually been located very different places, indicate that the documents did make it to other locations outside of Israel. However, there are 2 documents listed at the end that look like they're pure Essene documents written and kept only in the Dead Sea, Qumran area. What's good about this is that those particular documents are not key to understanding of the approximate location, approximate time when the Messiah might be kept. Those documents are superfluous in a way. You could gather pretty much the same type of information from the book of Daniel and other books. So I think we're okay as far as getting documents transferred, with one exception, and I'll get into that in just a minute. Go ahead, Gary. I mentioned the document I hadn't mentioned before. It's the Testament of Levi. To give you a little bit of a background, that there's a book that's called the Testaments of Levi. They're originally written in Arabic, somewhere between 133 BC and 107 BC. And there were copies of that document in the original Aramaic that was found in Qumran. And referring to the Messiah in chapter 18, verse 3 of the Testament of Levi, it states, "And his star will arise in heaven as a king, kindling the light of knowledge as day is illuminated by the sun." The key words are at the beginning, "and his star will arise." I had been looking for a reference like this for a long time. It was very difficult to find. I found it, and in my opinion, this is key. This is something that the Babylonians needed to have in order to know what to look for. Not an eclipse, not a conjunction, not something over there or whatever. They're looking for a rising star, and to them, that meant a heliacal rising. And for them, it was a heliacal rising of Jupiter. So the Messiah was expected in the 10th Jubilee year of the 8th decade of Jubilees. The Julian date for the last day of this Jubilee year was August the 30th of 2 BC. The next day, August 31st, was the first day of the Jewish civil year, 1 Tishri. That was called the Day of Trumpets. It was a holy day where the Jews would go out and blow trumpets. I think that's an important thing to know. The heliacal rising of Jupiter in the constellation Leo would have been on August the 29th or August the 30th. In addition to that, there was that coincided with what I call a massing of planets. You had Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and the moon and the sun clustered together in one location of the sky. That doesn't happen very often. What's neat about this is that Jupiter's heliacal rising on the 30th of August matches what the Magi said in Matthew 2:1. We saw his star at its rising. This ties Matthew's star of Bethlehem to an astronomical event at the time the Messiah was expected. With the heliacal rising of Jupiter, the Savior of the world, taking place at the end of a Jewish sabbatical year, when the Jewish Messiah was expected based on Jewish prophecy, coinciding with the massing of planets on a special day, the Day of Trumpets, it could have been a strong sign that the Messiah had been born. And this is a view from Stellarium of that rising of Jupiter. If you look over here in the middle, near the bottom, you have the planet Jupiter next to Venus. That is the first appearance of Jupiter after its conjunction with the sun in 2 BC. And right above it, you'll notice there's Leo. And the bright star in Leo, right above Jupiter, is Regulus, the king. Okay, next. And what I find to be interesting is that if you look on the last page of the Bible, the very last page, one of the very last statements in the Bible, you'll see this in Revelations chapter 22, verse 16. It's a quote of Jesus from Jesus himself. It says, "I am the root and offspring of David, the morning star shining bright." So I think that is, I think, a pretty startling thing to see, knowing what we just went through. Okay, okay, here's another problem though. The Testament of Levi referring to his star did not exist at the time of the Nativity. Now let's see what we can do about that. Go ahead, Gary. Well, it turns out that there are two different versions of this, the Testament of Levi. The first one is called the Aramaic Levi document, ALD. That document had been found earlier at different locations other than at Qumran. When you read that book, that does not have any mention of the star in there. However, you go to the next version called the Testament of Levi, period. That one also has been found outside of Qumran. And the Greek version that had been found before the Dead Sea Scrolls had been located mentions his star. At Qumran, they had found that particular document, but it's only in fragments. But luckily, there's one fragment called Fragment 9 that contains Testament of Levi, chapter 18, verse 3. And I have looked at that. And that does not mention the star either. So the Greek version, whenever it was translated into Greek, that is when the verse stating specifically the rising star, that's when that was put in. But the key thing of it is when did that book get translated into Greek? And the best that anybody can say is that it happened sometime before AD 50. There is no way that we can find out whether it had been translated sometime before, in these, like let's say 25 BC or maybe 2580. We just don't know. And that's what is maddening about this. I think that the Magi probably could have pulled this off without knowing this. But I think it certainly would have been a lot easier. And I think that the chances of them pulling this off without this particular verse would have been, the chances would have been cut down significantly. So the question is when did this get translated into Greek? And we just don't know. I think that's the key thing in this particular theory. Trying to figure out when this might have been translated into Greek. Okay, got another problem though. August 31st, September the 1st, 2 BC, and the Hebrew calendar was 1 Elul, not 1 Tishri, which would have been the feast of the trumpets. Well, let's see what we can do about that, Gary. It turns out that we don't have any knowledge of any year that the Jewish people had, what calendar they had, right around the time of the Nativity. Turns out that the Jewish calendar is lunisolar. What that means is that the months are aligned with the moon. So the first day of each month in the Jewish calendar is the first of that particular month. Because it's a the months are lunar, the calendar is only 254 days long. So somewhere to keep it in sync with the solar calendar, you have to insert a month. And we have no idea which months those, which years had a month inserted. There is a series of Jewish calendars that you can find on the internet that claim to represent the calendar that was in use at that time, but they don't jive. Some of them say this, and some others say this, and it turns out that the calendar I use actually does have September the 1st or August 31st being the first day of what was that? Can we go back one? Okay, yeah. Tishri. First of Tishri was the first of not only the month, but the first day of the year, civil year in the Jewish calendar. But we have no idea, exactly whether or not that was the case. So this is another unknown, but I strongly suspect that my calendar is just as good as any other calendar that you'll find on the internet. And I believe, in my opinion, that September the 1st, August the 31st of 2 BC was indeed the first day of the year. And then, like I said, this calendar that I'm using is in agreement with Voyager 4.5 and Application.net astronomy programs. Okay, and this is my calendar that I came up with, showing that there is no interpolation or insertion of a month from 3 BC to 2 BC over here, and that the 1st of September actually correlates to the first Kishu. Okay? So this is again a depiction of the calendar that I use for the Jewish year, the sabbatical year ending over here at the end of August of 2 BC, and going on into 1 BC where there is a month that's inserted in that particular year. One thing that's interesting on this chart to know is, like I mentioned before, when you look at the end of August of 2 BC, you'll notice that not only do you have a heliacal rising of Jupiter, you also have a massing of planets, and you have trumpets occurring at the same time. Okay, we got another problem. There's nothing in Jupiter's heliacal rising on August 29th of 2 BC to indicate the birth of a king. How in the world did the Magi know that he was a newborn king? And that's a good question, so I have an answer for you. Unfortunately, being an astronomer, I hate to say this, but I think it has to do with astrology. I don't know how else the Magi could have known that it was a newborn king that they were going to find other than by astrology. And if you look back around that time, there was a guy by the name of Valerius Maximus. He said this about the Magi. He said that they taught the motions of the stars, the courses of the planets, the force, individuality, and the effect of each one. And that's a clear indication that they were using astrology at that time. And in fact, Strabo had something even more pertinent to say. What he said was that in Babylonia, some Chaldeans, which the Babylonians were sometimes called, profess to be genealogists. And it turns out that genealogists are astrologers who cast individual nativities, which are natal horoscopes, which means that when somebody is born, you then look at the horoscope with the positions of the planets to forecast what his life is going to be like. And I think that what happened here with the heliacal rising of Jupiter in 2 BC, that's exactly what the Magi had done. They were looking for the heliacal rising of Jupiter, and they noticed that there was a grouping of planets, and this is what the horoscope would have looked like. Go ahead, Greg. This one right here. Look here. This depicts all the different astrological signs over here on the outer rim. And over here on the left, towards in that direction, that would be east. And what I've done is I have placed the exact locations of the sun and the planets and the moon along where the zodiac signs are. You'll notice all the planets along with the sun are grouped together over here in the eastern sky as they're rising up into the morning sky there. All alone, up here at the very top, we have one lone planet, it's called Saturn. And I think that must have been very significant to the Babylonians. Problem with the Babylonian astrology is that we really don't know how they may have interpreted this. In my opinion, they may have looked upon this as a clear indication that the Messiah was rising in the east, and that Saturn was going after Saturn, which is an evil planet. But that's just my interpretation. It turns out that we lack information about Babylonian astrology and horoscopy at the time of the Nativity, so we're not too sure exactly how to interpret this. But I had no idea or no doubt that if indeed this series of events went according to the way I look upon them, this was probably an indicative chart that showed that there was a Messiah that had been born. Okay, all right. Okay, so having looked at that horoscope, having seen the star and interpreted it as being representative of the Messiah that we had been born, the Magi would have made preparations to actually go to Jerusalem to seek him out. The total distance from Babylon to Jerusalem is over 1,000 kilometers, about 700 miles. That's a journey. So it probably took them something like on the order of a couple months to actually make the trip. I have 45 days here, but in any event, I would have expected them to arrive in Jerusalem sometime around mid-December of 2 BC. So before they made the trip, they had to know whether or not they were going to end in an enemy territory. A lot of books that you read, or I shouldn't say a lot, but some of the books that you read about the Nativity and Star of Bethlehem will indicate that the Magi would never have made the trip because Parthia, the Parthian Empire, and the Roman Empire were enemies. Not the case. There's a key thing that happened here in 220 BC. Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus met with the king of Parthia. It was on an island out there in the Euphrates River. And what he did was he got the standards that were lost by several regions when they were fighting the Parthians. At that time, he made peace with the Parthian Empire, And as you can see by the color indication, that whole time from 20 BC onward into the first century AD was a peaceful time between Parthia and the Roman Empire. So they were good to go. Okay. Okay, so this is where, you know, that I think that they would have taken from Babylon over here to Jerusalem. They would have followed the Euphrates River up to Mari and then across to Palmyra. Unfortunately, part of Palmyra was destroyed by ISIS several years ago. I think about 9 years ago. And that's just on ruins now. But in any event, they would have come down over here to Damascus. And guess what they would have picked up at Damascus? There's a road called the King's Highway. So I thought it would have been a pretty neat thing for them to have taken the King's Highway down here to, they show this in Rabbah. Actually, I think at the time it's called Philadelphia. And they would have then traveled over to Jerusalem to see King Herod. Okay. So this is a depiction of Jerusalem as it existed at the time of Jesus. The part that is in dark gray would have been the city itself. And Herod's palace would have been over here on the western side of the city along the gates or the wall. The Magi would have come in from the east, going up here and going through the gate over here to the temple. They would have gone over here and talked to the people. A lot of people think that the Magi would have been nuts to actually go to seek out King Herod at this time because, you know, with his history with the Parthians, it was not good. The thing of it is that isn't the way the story went. The Magi did not seek out King Herod. It was King Herod who sought out the Magi when he found out that they were in town. But anyway, in any event, after their meeting with King Herod, they would have taken the Hebron road to Bethlehem, shown over there on the left. Okay. Okay, now it turns out that Hebron road still exists today. Today it's called Israeli Route 60. So they took Route 60, basically, to Bethlehem. What I did was I took a map of that area with Route 60 in it, and I got a series of azimuths of that road at half-kilometer intervals. What I then did was I plotted that on a graph, and I tried to match that with the azimuth of Jupiter, and I'll show you that in a minute. Turns out that a good fit would have happened in December of 2 BC when they would have started their trip about when Jupiter was about 5 degrees west of due south from Jerusalem. And so that's what I did. I used Solarium to follow their travels, and why don't you go to the next chart, Gary? And this is what it looks like. Starting up here in Jerusalem up here, they would have traveled Route 60 down here. Route 60 ends basically right at this junction. But it still continues, the road continues, and that road is still called the Hebron Road. Well, when you follow this, you have a nice progression of azimuths until you reach that fork. And it's my contention is because they changed their azimuth at that point is when Jupiter then changed position in the sky relative to them, and instead of being more or less towards the front of them, it was more or less to the right-hand side of them. And it's my contention that the Holy Family's house was probably just south of that junction. So let's look and see what it looks like. Well, here's the graph. It's my graph. The solid lines are the azimuth of Jupiter for 2 different times offset by 5 minutes. Just to give you a feel for how things would change in that length of time. And then the dots, or the orange dots, or red dots, whatever they are, have been my measurement of azimuth in the road. And as you can see, there's a fairly good fit. It turns out that Jupiter at that time was very high in the sky. So it really didn't make a whole lot of difference whether they were exactly following this, going towards the star or not. It's high in the sky, it was in a head of them, so they didn't have to have an exact alignment. Okay, next. Well, this is what it looks like today. That fork in the road on the right hand or on the left hand side as they're traveling south contains what's called the Israeli West Bank barrier. This is called checkpoint 300. And as you can see, it's probably a little bit different from what it was like 2,000 years ago. Okay, but there is a controversial verse, and a lot of people have got hung up over it. What Matthew says is that after their audience with the king, they set out, and behold, the star that they had seen at its rising went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. And people had thought, that certainly could not have been a planet, could not have been anything natural. Therefore, the story is either made up or it's just not true. However, I have a different tag on it. I believe that could also be said of Jupiter and its travels. I mentioned that Jupiter did a loop during 3 and 2 BC, which caused a triple conjunction between Jupiter and Regulus. It turns out that Jupiter was at one of its stationary points in December of 2 BC. And I think that what that refers to is that it hadn't stopped, in its tracks as you're looking at, but it had stopped its motion and was then going to go and make its turn to go retrograde. So anyway, that's my take on it, and that's what I believe. So go ahead, Gary. So Jupiter at its stationary point, December 2 BC. It reached its first stationary point on December the 27th. And it turns out that when you look at the different predictions, the Babylonians had 2 types of clay tablets. One was called one was called the Almanac, and the other one had to do with recording actual positions and things like that. The Almanac contained predictions. And that's probably what they had with them when they went on their trip to Jerusalem. They probably had their predictions on the path, or the cycle of Jupiter. And they probably knew approximately when that first stationary point was going to happen. And based on my analysis of all their predictions, they could get that within plus minus 2 or 3 days. So that meant they knew that that Jupiter would have been stationary sometime between December the 24th and December the 30th of 2 BC. And what's really neat about that particular time with Jupiter being at that stationary point is that it was stopped midway between 2 stars in Virgo. One was Porrima, and the other one was the Naiad. And I'll show you that. Right here. What I did was I used Stellarium to take these screenshots. one on December the 20th, one for December the 25th, and one for December the 30th. And I, for the life of me, cannot see the difference between or among all these, these three different shots. For the human being, standing on the earth and looking up, for all practical purposes, Jupiter did stop. It was not moving. And as a result, that is a natural thing that they would have said that Jupiter, or the star that they had seen, stopped. Okay, Gary. And this is just a rundown of the data. I showed the time to sunrise for the departure time, time to sunrise, altitude of Jupiter at departure and arrival, altitude of Jupiter at sunrise and departure, and also the altitude of the sun at arrival. It's kind of embarrassing because I really didn't expect this when I did my analysis of it, but it turns out that one of the best days for them to have made the trip was December 25th. And that, it's embarrassing because I did not plan it that way. I would have preferred it to have been a different day. But it just turns out that way. And as far as I'm concerned, that's as good a day as any for them to have made the trip to Bethlehem. So instead of them visiting the Holy Family on December 25th for the birth of Jesus, it was probably December the 25th, and when they got there, he was probably about a year old. But anyway, that's what I have come up with, and this is what I did. Well, okay, but anyway, there's one more problem. There was a new moon on December the 26th of 2 BC. If the Magi traveled at night between December the 24th and 30th, they would have been unable to see where they were going. Let's see what we can do about that. Okay, Greg. Turns out that when they made the trip, the Magi almost, if they had made the trip, if the story is true, they almost, like, undoubtedly used two animals. They had camels that cross over the desert. They probably had horses to pack their belongings on. And one thing about horses is that just like cats and dogs, they have a tissue in their eye called the tapetum lucidum. What that tissue does is it reflects light that enters the eye back to the iris, so you're able to get very, very good night vision. So I can say that if the story is true, they almost undoubtedly had horses. And when you look at the writings, like for Sable, the caravans that used camels at the time actually did travel at night, and they directed their course by observing the stars. So there's no doubt in my mind that they could have made the trip, even at night. And so what were the light sources? They had the planets Venus, Jupiter, and Mars, very bright objects in the sky, and first magnitude stars. There's a whole slide of them, won't mention them, but I think there's 12 of the first magnitude stars that were out at that night. There's the Milky Way, which is what's neat about this particular day when it comes to the Milky Way. When you get on Solarium and down in December the 25th for this time, the Milky Way is parallel to the horizon, all the way from the northeast to the southwest. But as they made their trip, the part of the Milky Way in the southeast tilted because of the Earth's rotation. So they got more and more light as the night wore on. So they had light. And I think that they really could have made this trip. Now the other thing too is even if they didn't have that, they could have used lanterns too, but. I have no idea what they might have done. Anyway, here it is. This is where Jupiter became the star of Bethlehem. This is the view of the sky, I think, that the Magi would have had when they, when they finished their trip to Bethlehem. They looked up and they could see the star over here high in the sky. And it was, let's see, it was right over here with their friend Regulus and Leo also. So that, I think, is what the scene would have looked like. Okay, one more. What's really neat about this is that after the meeting, everybody can go out and see the Star of Bethlehem if you believe the star existed and the story is true. When you walk out tonight, if we have a clear sky, you'll be able to see a full moon in the east, and you'll be able to see the Star of Bethlehem, aka Jupiter, in the west. It's for those, if we have anybody from the Midwest watching, that'll be true for the Midwesterners also. And that's pretty much it.
Thank you.
Laura?
Oh, well, I was studying about the Mayans, and they're still finding some astronomical things. And I'm just wondering if you look at, I know the Chinese, the Arabs, around the world, people did this. And it would be maybe worth to look at this time of history and see if there were any records by other people. There may be, because the retrograde Jupiter is kind of interesting.
Yeah, you're right. There were interesting things that happened at this time.
Right.
It'd be nice to see if there were any records. I don't think you will find it, except for in China. Chinese kept very good records, and I'm sure they have a fair chance of finding something there. But when it comes to any connection to the Messiah,
Well, not necessarily, just that they observed,
Yeah.
you know, Jupiter and the.
it would be
It was
neat
interesting
if you could find a
information.
record that showed the merger of Jupiter and Venus on June 17th. Now, I think that would be cool, just to know that somebody actually saw it, you know.
Right, right. And there was also, you just mentioned at the end how people traveling the desert would navigate by star. What did you say, navigate by stars? It wasn't like they don't use camels don't have good night.
Now, camels only have that tissue.
But navigating by night, I had never thought by stars. And I realize now Polynesians, I was thinking of other parts of the world. Has anyone ever proposed that instead of navigating by day, they navigated across the Pacific by night?
Well, you know, when you're on the ocean, you go wherever the water is, you know. But yeah, as far as actually steering the boat, they had two things that they could go on. During the day, using the sun. Sun at midday is south.
But it'd be so much easier at night, you got
They
lights.
could do it at night, and when I got the North Star and guideline, that's what Captain Kirk always said on Star Trek. Just give me a ship with the star to guide me, and I'm happy. Yeah, talking about the Mayans, I think it was the Mayans or the Aztecs. You look at the alignment of the temples down in Mexico, they're not aligned with what you might think. You know, like the moon, the sun, or whatever. Venus. Venus apparently was a very important star for them in that area at that time. And I know that, I think the big, it's not a temple, but I guess an administration building is aligned with, you know, so that you could see Venus at its most eastern view. I'm sorry, yeah, eastern view on the eastern.
Well, these people are really in the night sky, and so I like the idea that Marduk And these people came from the east and they saw potential of something important happening, and that they would travel west following their astronomical portends something important. And it's not inconceivable at all because people did that.
Yeah, you know, when you're doing research like this, try sometimes to put yourself into their shoes. It's hard. I don't think you can do it. They lived at a different time, a different era, they had different customs, they had. It's, you know, one of the guys I have been in communication with on this topic is a guy who lives in France, southern France. And he grew up in Kentucky, just south of where I grew up. And he has a whole chapter in this book saying, it's titled, How to Think Like a Magi. I think that that's gone a little bit too far. I told him that. I said, you know, there's no way that you could tell people how Magi thought, because we don't, first of all, we don't know that much about Magi. And secondly, trying to put yourself into their shoes at that particular time, having you know the history that we have, you know, as a person, you just can't do that. I don't think. But there's, as you can see, there's a lot of research that goes into something like this, and I think, you know, it's really neat when you find something that you think really fits, and gives me a lot of pleasure doing that. It's something I think, you know, I'd like to share with other people. That's why I did this presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.